Hey, in this video I will cover children's clothing regulations in the EU. So we'll begin by looking into REACH and explaining how REACH applies to children's clothing. Then we move on to GPSD, safety standards, labeling, and finally packaging. Right, so we start with REACH. Now, REACH regulation covers all consumer goods, not just children's clothing. Just want to make that clear. And in practice, what the REACH regulation does is that it restricts, bans, and sets limitations on various chemicals and heavy metals. In practice, what this means is that if you are selling children's clothing in the EU, the fabrics, zippers, buttons, Velcro, etc., cannot contain restricted substances above the set limits. This includes lead, cadmium, nickel, mercury, various phthalates like DHP, etc. Okay, so it's a sort of a catch-all substance regulation. That's what it comes down to. And this means that from a supply chain perspective, you need to be very careful when you pick your suppliers, because you need to be very confident that they have the capability to procure materials that are compliant. Otherwise, you risk mass producing or ordering a batch of goods, children's clothing in this case, that contain substances above the set limits, and then you can't sell those products. And there's no way to fix this. If there's no way to repair or tweak a fabric that contains a certain substance above the limit. And in order to verify compliance, you need third-party lab testing. In theory, you should be able to rely on suppliers providing test reports, but I can say from experience that when it comes to the apparel industry, it's very unlikely that manufacturers, at least outside the EU, can provide test reports for all the materials. At best, you can receive test reports that come from large material suppliers like YKK. They produce zippers and so on, and it's a big Japanese company. You may have heard of them. They are I think they only produce REACH compliant zippers, for example. But when it comes to fabrics from smaller local suppliers, it's very unlikely that they can provide pre-existing substance test reports, even if they are very confident that the materials are compliant. Okay, let's move on. Let's look into the GPSD. The GPSD is sort of a catch-all. It essentially states that all consumer goods sold in the EU must be safe. And what the GPSD does is that it provides lists of harmonized or reference standards, that at least one of which covers children's clothing. That being said, the GPSD is also very clear in that even if there are no product-specific standards in place, you must do your utmost to ensure compliance. And this goes beyond the harmonized standards, and they also mention that if there are no such standards in place, you have to look to voluntary standards. That means other non-harmonized EN standards, and maybe even national standards, and beyond that, international standards. But the point of the GPSD is that no matter what, you have to ensure that your products are safe. And luckily, there's a variety of EN standards that apply to children's clothing in the EU, covering general safety aspects and also flammability. You can find a list on compliancegate.com, by the way. So where REACH covers substances, the GPSD and EN standards as a whole go beyond that, because safety is not just about heavy metals and chemicals. Okay, let's look into labeling requirements. So these labeling requirements are not specific to children's clothing, but to most textile products sold in the EU. And most important part, the first one I will mention anyway, is that of the fiber composition. You need to specify the material type. That could be 100% cotton, 100% polyester, maybe some mixed fabric, mixed fiber. At least on an EU level, it doesn't cover care instructions and size labeling, but it can be required nationally. And why would you leave that out anyway? Point three, product labeling or marking should, generally speaking, be provided in the official languages of the EU member states where you are selling. And I understand that can be a bit confusing with e-commerce, especially cross-border e-commerce within the EU. Aren't you, at least in theory, selling EU-wide? Yeah, that's something that can be debated. But anyway, that's what they say. All right, finally, we have the packaging and the packaging waste directive. And I'm not going to go into the scope of the entire directive, but with, at least in the context of children's clothing, there are two things to consider. And the first is substance restrictions in packaging materials. There's a list of heavy metals that are restricted. Similar principle as with REACH in this case, which also applies to packaging materials, just to be clear. And second is that of extended producer responsibility. So when you're selling in the EU, you need to register with a PRO or a producer responsibility organization, and you essentially pay them to for the sake of waste management, for waste collection, operating waste collection stations, operating recycling facilities, and so on. It's essentially, you have to self-report the volume that you sell in terms of packaging waste on an annual basis, and then you pay a fee. If you're a startup brand, you don't have to be too worried because it's not that expensive. It can be less than 100 euros per year, if that. But it's something you have to do, and you have to register on that on a national level. In any case, we have a video dedicated specifically to EPR requirements in the EU. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can write a comment in the comment section on YouTube or go to our website, compliancegate.com.